Welcome to the CSAE Conference. It's a great pleasure for me to have you here, Abebe. It's nice to be able to briefly talk around some of the issues that Africa is facing. So allow me to start with a general question. We observe a global slowdown. We observe all kinds of issues, of course, that fall out from COVID, the global food crisis, or at least food price crisis, inflationary pressures in lots of countries, macroeconomic issues. What does it look like as seen from Africa?
Stefan, thank you so much for inviting me, and it's really very good to be here in person. I think the region is going through one of the more difficult economic periods over the last many decades. Honestly, I mean, as we speak, there is a really brutal funding crunch that the region is facing, for example. But in a way, kind of, how we got to where we are starts around the development model that countries were pursuing in the 20 odd years since the turn of the century. A period, of course, where tremendous development progress was made. Tremendous, really. We underestimate just how much improvement has been. Really important development indicators, declines in infant mortality, life expectancy increases, even the level of schooling, etc., which have all gone up to varied degrees across the region, but in a generalized way, there's been really very, very strong progress. Not as much progress perhaps on poverty reduction, but still a period where there was a lot of progress. And this was paid for increasingly over the years through more expensive forms of financing. As ODA declined, countries made more and more recourse to commercial borrowing. So by 2015-16, I would say kind of debt vulnerabilities in the region had increased. And what happened basically is that the series of really brutal shocks that the region has been hit by increasingly is pushing countries over the edge. And so right now, I think one generalized comment I can make is that macroeconomic imbalances are back with a vengeance in the region as the first order economic challenge. What this has done is divert much needed resource and attention from continuing to make progress on development outcomes that is so important for the future of the continent. And then right now, kind of, why things are so acute is that, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as you said, commodity price increases, and the countries being shut out of markets. What we're seeing is this really very tight financing conditions that governments are facing. And one worry we have is that increasingly, even countries where the macroeconomic situation is manageable and debt levels are affordable, will be unable to stay in this vein because liquidity is drying up, and as even solvent countries can become insolvent for lack of liquidity. So it's a moment when the region requires both some external financing and internally a deep rethink as to the kind of a development model we want to follow in the coming years. But I should also, though, say that whenever I'm on the ground, I continue to be impressed by just how much resilience there is in the region now, by how much opportunity and how much going forward there's so much upside. So that's my take on where we are.
It's interesting what you say. It's like reflecting on the development model that had been followed. But of course, there's been a lot of diversity in the last 10, 15, 20 years, with some countries growing considerably faster than others. Ghana also being able to, for example, halving extreme poverty in the last 30 years, while Nigeria remaining a highly impoverished country with increasing numbers of extreme poor. Is there something to be said about that certain countries in the current crisis are maybe being punished for the kind of development models they were using? And is there a case to be made to think in a much more differentiated way about the experience of countries?
So, I think one thing, one comment I want to make on Nigeria is just the heterogeneity of circumstances in Nigeria itself. So I think if you compare what's going on in Southwest and, Northeast, Maiduguri, or or area, I think there's huge difference in circumstances and economic outcomes. My sense is you would have a lot more of the Ethiopia-Ghana story in Southwest, even the big chunks of the center, than that, so there's a lot of similarity. So I think we have to allow for that in Nigeria. But overall, of course, Nigeria, I don't think, has lived up to the tremendous potential that it has in aggregate. So that point remains there. Now, turning to the other success cases, and it's not just Ethiopia and Ghana, like there are many other countries where we saw quite a bit of progress. I don't think it's not so much that they're being blamed, but I don't think there's enough appreciation as to how much external factors have contributed to the macroeconomic difficulties countries are facing right now. How much exogenous factors have contributed. I think there's not enough of an appreciation for that. Now, this said, I think, at the end of the day, countries have a lot of agency, the most agency. And importantly also, there were some things that were not done well. So I think, in both countries, but others too, there was a lot of investment in the right areas, but not enough effort to capture these rates of returns via the tax system in particular. Countries also have not perhaps focused on the tradable sector enough relative to kind of investment in non-tradable. So I think, again, there is some attention that needed to be paid to that, and not having paid enough attention also is a contributing factor to varying degrees in the difficulties that we are seeing. But I think all told, what is needed at the moment is three things. I think one is a lot of counter-cyclical support, okay? Because again, it is the massive shift in external circumstances that has pushed many countries over the edge. Second, countries need to, of course, do a lot of reforms to get macroeconomic imbalances under control. There's no doubting that, and of course also improving, the value for money that you get from public spending. We are no longer in the era of cheap external borrowing or even domestic borrowing. And then the third thing I think that is going to be as important really is a revisit and a rethink about official development assistance, which over the years has been declining. Now, it was one thing when that decline happened, when countries could easily go out and replace this ODA with borrowing from capital markets, from new creditors like China. But now we are in this world where money is not as readily available. It is, I'm afraid to say, kind of the hit will happen. I mean, it's going to be felt much more acutely now. So I think really important that there is work done on all these areas going forward.
So one of the striking things that we observe is the fact that ODA, so official development assistance, so essentially aid, has not been acting counter-cyclically during the crisis. Now it's not increasing. If anything, a lot of countries seem to be cutting aid. So maybe we're discovering again that aid as seen from donor countries is a bit like charity. We spend more on it when our incomes go up, but we actually bring it down when our incomes are indeed going down. How can we think more about it, and is this something that we can change? Is there any signs of hope you could have in this respect going forward?
So, a few thoughts on this. I mean, I think, look, I mean, my argument is not so much that, official development of assistance should be sustained no matter what, but in circumstances where, good reforms are being pursued, and also in areas where the development gaps are really largest, if we don't support these countries, I mean, it's really failing to invest in the future of this global economy. I mean, one number that really hit me with quite a bit of force when I discovered it some years ago is that by 2030, 1 out of every 2 new entrants into the global labor force will come from sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so these are the people, the people reaching the age of 15 by around 2030, and these kids have been born. They are going to school or should be going to school. They should be getting really good education now, because they are the ones that are going to be the future key members of the labor force. And by failing to invest now, by failing to support human capital development in the region now, and a lot of this has to happen through aid, because governments just do not have the wherewithal to be able to generate enough tax revenues to build enough schools, to build enough clinics and universities that are needed. By failing to do that, I think we're harming ourselves, and I think we don't think enough about where we're going to be 10, 15 years from now, and the urgent, as always, kind of crowds out the really important and the strategic investments that need to be made. So I think those kind of intellectual arguments, though, I don't see being made enough, honestly, by the champions of development. So I think we need to amp up our messaging on this front. And then the other thing I want to say is, in our case at the fund, I mean, we provided between 2020 and 2022 something of the order of $60 billion in financing. Many multiples of the amount of financing we provided over the previous decade, and rightly so. But our ability to continue providing this kind of financing is now constrained because we've run out of the resources we need to subsidize and lower the cost of financing through our PRGT window. I guess much the same at the World Bank also, because they also made a big push to provide financing in the years. So I think using the balance sheet of these entities is, I think, one also important avenue in this difficult period that we can support countries.
That is quite an important point you make. It's also trying to change the discourse from the overseas development assistance, that is the official development assistance that's being given, as something that is some kind of charitable act in countries, but you are really appealing also on the economic self-interest of countries, given that that's where Africa is, where the labor force will be. And finally, our conference attracts a lot of young scholars, especially from Africa, that want to work around key challenges, issues of African economies. What would you advise a scholar trying to work on African economies? What would you recommend them they should be looking at? What are the key questions you feel like need to be addressed?
Okay, so I'm going to show my bias towards more policy-relevant questions. I mean, things that vex us at the IMF. So I think one really big question that I keep asking myself, we keep bringing up, is development. Higher domestic savings is a really important ingredient, of course, in self-funding of countries, right? As Arthur Lewis many years ago pointed out. So I don't see enough of those kind of research questions. I think we've gone away from asking these kind of big questions to more tractable questions in academia. And I would love for thinking again about what are the things that can be done to engender more domestic savings in developing countries, in the poorest countries. Of course, demographics play a role, but are there other policy interventions that we could be thinking about? I think that's one question that really is important. Another one I think revolves around, of course, these are all related to the current macro challenge, revolves around ways in which more resources can be mobilized by the government. Specifically, the point I said earlier, I didn't internalize enough when I was at grad school. Nick Stern, I remember once saying something along the lines that the existential development challenge is the inability of governments to capture the rates of returns in all the projects that they invest. And when I see all the effort countries have made in recent years to build roads, to build, to increase energy supply, but having failed to either install tolls to collect enough revenues to pay for the roads that they've built, or raised utility tariffs sufficiently to allow the electricity company to repay. So are there, both at the macro level, but also even at the project level, what is it that can be done to allow governments to better capture these rates of returns on these investments? I think this again is an area which is really ripe for some research. Now, like all questions about revenue mobilization, this of course is a deeply political question here. So there's no getting around the fact that this is related to the social contract and or even the political economy questions that you yourself have been asking. But there are also, I think, there are some technical, a bit more technocratic, a bit more technical questions and research that can be done. So I think that's yet another area where I think some attention could be paid to.
The last 30 years clearly have been very good for development, and in fact ever since the end of the Cold War there's clearly much more space to work as, for example, as the IMF, as a more technocratic organization. Of course politics is always there, but in a sense geopolitics wasn't really determining the direction. Now we're definitely living, not least since the start of COVID and then the start of the war in Ukraine, in an age where geopolitics has become so much more important. What do you think that means for organizations like the IMF, but also what does it mean for countries, and how can they deal with the challenges that it brings?
But very important and profound question. So first, I think, I agree with you strongly that the last, basically the period since the end of the Cold War has allowed multilateral institutions to be less political because, you no longer had these competing camps. Ideologically also, I think there was kind of a strong consensus around, I don't want to say, maybe consensus itself is a loaded phrase, given its association with the Vatican consensus, but I think there was a lot of pragmatism in terms of, making sure that policy experimentation, but also a lot of peer-to-peer, cross-country learning that we facilitated, I think, in our institutions over the years. I think, as always, though, when you have geopolitical tensions, this increasing fragmentation, that also makes it a little bit more difficult for multilateral institutions to continue functioning in a purely technocratic way. Thankfully, up to now, I think we've warded off a lot of interference at the IMF. So I think, we continue to try, at least on the economic side, make the right calls and continue to provide that technical advice to our members. I think, but going forward, it's something that we have to ward against. As you see, kind of, challenges to global supply chains or policies and, for example, industrial policies. the interesting thing right now is that it's not just broader geopolitical issues like that have been impacting, industrial policy, but even kind of, how much support do you make for new emerging industries like climate and the tensions between Europe and the US. So it's not just, the schism has not just been along the bigger geopolitical rivalries. So I think, it is definitely a period where we have to, continue to make the case for multilateralism, continue to make the case for technocratic, sustained technocratic advice. And on the country side, I think, maybe continuing in the same vein that countries were trying to be in the 80s also. I don't know if you remember the non-aligned movement. Basically, making clear that there are deeper, countries have strategic interests in their engagement with, the broad gamut of the global economy, the global economic leaders, and sustaining that, that approach, I think, will be really very important. Because, if you're asked to choose one camp or another, God forbid, we have that kind of fragmentation, the cost is going to be borne by the poorer countries, which have less resilience, which are going to be asked to disrupt trade or financial engagement with one camp or the other. So I think the region, really cannot afford to say I'm going to do one thing or another.
It's a great pleasure for me to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's really very good to be